Brittany Gatchell. I'm a therapist for individuals who have experienced adult sexual assault or child sexual abuse and have worked with clients from Bible-based cults. Say I were to work with a former Scientologist. What are some things that would be helpful to know in working with former members? What are the top 3 things that you believe are the most difficult for Scientologists coming out of the organization? Boy, there are so many issues and points to cover on something like this. I don't know that I can really just narrow it down to 3 things or the top 3 things. Of course, also, this is very, very subjective because my answer is going to be based completely on my own experiences, and other people might have, other issues that they're going to flare up or come up with them. I would say to somebody newly coming out of the subject that or seeking therapy or help with it, that it's, one, really great that they are seeking any counseling or therapy or help. And one of the things you'll need to overcome is the anti-psychiatry message that L. Ron Hubbard preaches. And they'll be very tentative, very fearful, very cautious or careful about anything having to do with psychology or psychiatry. So that should be addressed actually head on. And any false information or out-of-date narratives that Hubbard pushes about psychiatry should definitely be addressed, so that the former Scientologist has a chance to air all of their fears and anxieties and issues with anything other than Scientology counseling, because that's the only model that they've had. And they'll also need to be educated a bit on the differences between what psychologists actually do versus what Scientology does in its auditing, because Scientology auditing, as Sunny and I discussed actually in our last video, it's only a dim analogy of counseling. Calling Scientology auditing counseling, or calling it the same as or similar to psychological counseling is really technically a pretty big misnomer. We only use that analogy because it's the only thing that kind of immediately communicates the idea of a therapist and a patient, and there's a relationship there, and there's questions being asked and answers being given. So, so there's a rough analogy to be drawn, but there's so many differences. That would be something I think that should be tackled as part of that. The idea of what is a cult, cultic thinking, abusive relationships, narcissistic relationships. What is narcissism? I mean, these kinds of things is another whole thing that should probably be entered on in terms of educating the person on what they have experienced as a Scientologist, of course, depending on how long they were involved. The longer they were involved, the more deeply they're going to be in a kind of a semi-narcissistic mindset, I think. Scientology sort of creates that in people. So coming to an awareness of what that's all about, that they are not the center of the universe, is a thing, that the relative importance of themselves compared to the rest of the world, that they're no longer in a position where they feel like they're gonna, or they should get into a place where they feel like they don't need to think they're saving the world anymore, kind of stripping some of that away also. Scientology is really big on that. There's a lot of messages in Scientology about its importance, how it's a deadly serious activity, live or die in the attempt. We'd rather have you dead than incapable as a Scientologist. I mean, these are phrases Hubbard uses in his key policies and issues. And former Scientologists need to be gotten over the idea that they are somehow unique and special and elite and different and better than everybody else. That's a process. Maybe addressing some of the ideas surrounding that without, obviously, I can't tell a therapist how to do their job. I'm not a therapist. So obviously all of this would be done in such a manner that, would fit the person you're talking to. I'm just sort of trying to talk in vague terms, not vague, but general issues that I think should be addressed for somebody newly coming out. I'm trying to think of when I first came out and where my mind was at, where my head was at. Critical thinking is really important, and getting across the ideas of critical thinking and the ability to question anything, questioning authority, questioning rules and guidelines and regulations, because that's not acceptable in Scientology. You follow the rules or you are history. That's really important. So, kind of learning or gaining independence of thought and action. These are really important steps, and a like a cognizant realization that the person is taking these steps, I think is important. So they can kind of gain some of their own power back, and their own self-confidence. My experience as a Sea Org member, of course, was pretty intense. Not necessarily the same as your run-of-the-mill public Scientologist or even a staff member. Sea Org is kind of its own level of mind screwery. So maybe I'm talking too much about some of this stuff in terms of former Sea Org. I couldn't really say. Like I said, this is only from my own experience. So addressing the false information, addressing critical thinking and reasoning, and the fact that there's multiple sources of true information out there, not just one single source. There's multiple ways of getting things done, not just one way, Hubbard's way or the highway, kind of getting a person into this kind of mindset. And then, of course, finally assimilating back into the real world, how to communicate with people, rationally and normally, and not assertively or in a fashion where, I'm right, you're wrong, this is the way it is, sort of thing. Scientologists can come on a bit strong because they are indoctrinated to do that. And they feel, as Scientologists, that they are the elite of the elite, the upper 10% of the upper 10% of planet Earth human beings. So maybe that's addressed a little bit in some of that narcissism I was talking about earlier, but the reassimilation process is really important, and also, and this also goes along with the critical thinking thing is that it's okay to question anything, that sort of thing, maybe questioning some of the beliefs that they were given in Scientology. What were those beliefs? How did you interpret them? What did you think Hubbard meant by these things? And how do you see that now? And as they compare and contrast the Scientology beliefs with, things that they're encountering in the real world. And being willing to look at critical information about Scientology. That's an important step also. And it might be a step that's going to take people a long time to get to. Not everybody is eager to jump on the internet and learn all about Xenu. And that, I don't think that should be necessarily forced on somebody's throat, but it should be encouraged. And I think that's a path the person's eventually going to need to take in order to totally strip off, the layers of bullshit that they've been fed. We make analogies in the ex-Scientology community about how it's like layers of an onion that come off, a layer at a time. You gradually take off one, and then there's a whole nother layer, and you take that off, and then there's a whole nother layer of Scientology indoctrination. So there's a lot of different things in Scientology people can be indoctrinated into. There's so much information. So there's not like a checklist you'd follow. Okay, now we're going to do that, now we're going to do this, because it's individual for each person. What appeals to one person about Scientology and gets them going down this path might be totally different from, Bill over here, from Joe here, who got into Scientology for a whole different reason, and so his path was different from Bill and Joe, and so they might have a whole different set of courses they've done, different things they've addressed in their auditing. So it's not like there's some universal checklist of things you can do to to tick off all the points, and now you're done, and now Scientology is no longer, in this person's head. You gotta deal with the person in front of you. So, I don't know. I hope that's helpful and somewhat, interesting and illuminating for people as to what sort of things I think might be important about that. And I can't stress enough the importance of therapists learning about what destructive cults actually are. If you haven't read Lifton, if you haven't read Janja Lalich or Steve Hassan or Singer or these works, you just don't know what you're doing when it comes to dealing with ex-cult members. I just don't know any other more blunt way to say it, but it's just true, and you don't want to spend valuable therapy time having your patient have to educate you on what these destructive cults are all about and how they operate. It's really, really incumbent upon you to learn about that stuff. I'm not saying, you, the person who asked me this question, are ignorant of this. I'm not saying that at all. I'm broadly answering this question by saying anybody who's watching this who has a therapeutic background or practice, that is the single best piece of advice I can give you as a therapist in dealing with ex-cult members. Because if you have a good grounding in how these groups operate and what the points of control are and undue influence and how they hit these things, then you'll be able to address almost anybody in any destructive cult former members. So there you go.